Richard Carter believed he had won. He walked away from 23 years of marriage, abandoned the woman who had prayed for him through every struggle, and started a new life with someone else. Evelyn was left with heartbreak, a tiny apartment, and questions only God seemed to hear. But what Richard didn't know was that while he was celebrating his freedom, God was quietly preparing a blessing no one saw coming. A forgotten letter, a family secret, and a piece of land the entire town believed was worthless. The next chapter of this story wouldn't just change Evelyn's life, it would change Richard's forever. Let's continue. Sometimes the greatest blessings arrive disguised as ordinary moments, not through miracles that shake the earth, not through dramatic signs in the sky, but through something as simple as an old box gathering dust in a storage unit. 6 months after the divorce, Evelyn's life had settled into a painful routine. Each morning she woke up in the tiny apartment, made coffee, read her Bible, prayed, then searched for ways to rebuild a future she never expected to face alone. The pain hadn't disappeared. Some days were still incredibly difficult. Some nights still felt unbearably lonely. But something inside her had changed since that prayer beside her bed. She wasn't surviving anymore. She was healing slowly, quietly, one day at a time. One Saturday morning, Evelyn decided to tackle something she had been avoiding for months: the storage unit. After selling the family home, dozens of boxes had been placed in storage. Boxes filled with photographs, documents, old furniture, family keepsakes. Memories she wasn't ready to face, until now. The weather was cool when she arrived. The storage facility sat on the edge of town, quiet, almost forgotten, much like she felt some days. As she unlocked the metal door, rows of boxes greeted her. 23 years of life packed into cardboard containers. For a moment she considered leaving, the memories still hurt. But something told her to keep going, so she began sorting: photographs first, then books, then old decorations. Hours passed. Dust filled the air. To her in her father's handwriting. Evelyn's hands trembled. For several seconds she simply stared at it. The letter looked old, years old, as though it had been waiting patiently for this moment, waiting for her to find it. Slowly she opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. The paper had yellowed with age, but the words remained clear. My dearest Evelyn, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer here to explain these things myself. There is something I need you to know, something our family has owned for generations. Most people believe the land north of Willow Creek is worthless. They always have. But never sell it unless you absolutely must. One day it may become more valuable than anyone can imagine. The ownership documents are enclosed. I love you, Dad. Evelyn frowned. Land. What land? She continued, searching through the envelope. Then found several legal documents: property deeds, survey maps, ownership records, all bearing her family's name. The land covered hundreds of acres, much more than she remembered, much more than she thought remained in the family. Confused, she gathered everything and drove home. That evening she spread the documents across her dining table. Something didn't make sense. Her father had never spoken much about this property. Most people in town considered that area worthless, dry, remote, undeveloped, practically useless. Why would he protect it so carefully? And why leave such specific instructions? The questions kept her awake that night. By Monday morning, curiosity had become determination. She contacted a local attorney, a man who specialized in property law. 2 days later, she sat across from him in his office. He carefully reviewed every document, occasionally adjusting his glasses, occasionally rereading pages. As the meeting continued, his expression changed. At first he seemed curious, then surprised, then visibly confused. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. Carter. Yes, I think these documents need a deeper investigation. A knot formed in her stomach. What does that mean? It means your father may have owned considerably more than anyone realized. Attorney assembled a team: researchers, surveyors, title specialists. Weeks passed, then months. Meanwhile, Evelyn tried not to get her hopes up. After everything she'd endured, disappointment felt safer than optimism. Most likely there had been some misunderstanding. Most likely the land wasn't worth much. Most likely nothing would come from it, at least that's what she told herself. Then one Thursday afternoon her phone rang. It was the attorney. His voice sounded different, excited, almost shocked. Evelyn, I need you to come to my office immediately. Her heart began racing. Is something wrong? No, a pause, then he said something she would never forget. Something extraordinary has happened. 30 minutes later, she was seated across from him. Several other people occupied the conference room, lawyers, consultants, property experts. Everyone looked unusually serious. The attorney slid a file across the table. "Do you know anything about Horizon Dynamics?" Evelyn shook her head. "No. It's one of the largest technology infrastructure companies in the country." Still confused, she waited. The attorney continued. "They've spent the past 3 years quietly acquiring land across this region." Evelyn's stomach tightened. "What does that have to do with me?" The room fell silent. Then came the answer: everything. The attorney opened a large map. Several sections were highlighted: roads, development zones, infrastructure corridors, data facilities, power grids, fiber networks. The entire project stretched across thousands of acres. And directly in the center sat her land. The land everyone considered worthless. The land her father refused to sell. The land she had nearly forgotten existed. For several seconds, Evelyn couldn't speak. Neither could anyone else. The attorney pointed to the highlighted area. "Horizon Dynamics needs this property." "Why?" "Because without it, their entire development plan becomes significantly more expensive." The room felt smaller. The air felt heavier. Evelyn stared at the map, trying to process what she was hearing. Then came the question: how much is the land worth? Nobody answered immediately. The attorney looked toward another consultant. The consultant cleared his throat, then finally spoke. The number that followed changed Evelyn's life forever. A number so large it sounded impossible. A number that transformed a forgotten piece of family land into one of the most valuable properties in the entire state. At that moment, Evelyn realized something. The prayer she whispered on her apartment floor months earlier had not been ignored. God had been working all along. While she mourned, while she cried, while she questioned, while she waited, a door she couldn't see had already begun opening. And very soon, the woman everyone pitied would become the woman everyone wanted to know, including one man who had already thrown her away. A man named Richard Carter. Because when news of the land reached him, his world was about to change just as dramatically as Evelyn's. Only not in the way he expected. The phone call lasted less than 15 minutes, but when Evelyn walked out of her attorney's office that afternoon, she was no longer the same woman who had walked in. For months, she had been living in survival mode, trying to rebuild, trying to heal, trying to understand why her life had fallen apart now. For the first time since the divorce, something unexpected had entered the picture. Hope. Real hope. Not the fragile kind that disappears with bad news. The kind that arrives when circumstances begin changing faster than anyone thought possible. Still, Evelyn remained cautious. After everything she had endured, she refused to celebrate too early. The attorneys continued their negotiations with Horizon Dynamics. Survey teams visited the property. Engineers conducted evaluations. Environmental specialists arrived. Every week brought another meeting, another report, another update. And with every update, the value of the land increased, then increased again. And again. The original estimates suddenly seemed too low. What started as a few $1 million quickly became tens of millions, then dozens of millions, then numbers so large Evelyn struggled to comprehend them. Each new valuation felt impossible. At one point she sat staring at a report for nearly 20 minutes, certain she was reading it incorrectly, certain a mistake had been made. Because people like Evelyn didn't become wealthy overnight. At least, that's what she had always believed. But reality was beginning to tell a different story. One afternoon, her attorney finally delivered the news. The deal was complete. Horizon Dynamics had officially agreed to purchase the property. The final amount exceeded every expectation. By the time taxes, investments, royalties, and development agreements were included, Evelyn's net worth had crossed into the hundreds of millions. The woman who had once worried about paying rent was suddenly one of the wealthiest people in the state. For several minutes she simply sat in silence, not celebrating, not crying, just trying to absorb what had happened. Her thoughts drifted immediately to her father, the letter, the warning, the land he refused to sell, the wisdom nobody understood, and for the first time she fully grasped why he had protected it for so long. The following weeks felt surreal. Financial advisors appeared, investment firms called, banks requested meetings, business executives wanted introductions, people who had never spoken to her suddenly wanted her attention, everyone wanted access, everyone wanted a relationship, everyone wanted a piece of the opportunity. The same world that had ignored her was now rushing toward her. But Evelyn never forgot where she came from, nor did she forget what it felt like to lose everything. Instead of spending recklessly, she moved carefully. Deliberately, prayerfully, she assembled a trusted team, accountants, lawyers, investment specialists, people whose integrity mattered more than their resumes. For the first time in years, she felt something she thought she had lost, confidence, not because of money. Because she finally understood that her future no longer depended on anyone else's decisions, not Richard's, not public opinion, not circumstances. God had carried her through the storm. And now she was standing on solid ground again. News of the transaction eventually became public. At first it appeared in local newspapers. Then regional media outlets picked up the story. Soon television stations began calling. Reporters wanted interviews. Business magazines wanted features. National media wanted to tell the story of the divorced woman whose forgotten family land had made her extraordinarily wealthy. People loved the story. The abandoned wife. The hidden inheritance. The unexpected reversal, the dramatic comeback, everyone wanted to hear it. Yet whenever journalists asked her how she felt, her answer surprised them. One reporter leaned forward during an interview and asked, "Do you feel vindicated?" Evelyn smiled gently. "No," reporter looked confused. "You don't," she shook her head. "Feel grateful." The interview quickly went viral because people expected anger, they expected revenge, they expected bitterness. Instead, they found humility. And the public couldn't get enough of it. As months passed, Evelyn purchased a beautiful home overlooking rolling countryside outside Willow Creek. It wasn't the largest house she could afford, not even close. But it felt peaceful, warm, comfortable, a place that felt like home. Unlike the mansion she once shared with Richard, this house represented freedom. Every room reflected her choices, her values, her future. For the first time in years, she slept peacefully. Yet the greatest surprise wasn't how she spent the money. It was how much she gave away. The memory of her own suffering remained fresh. She remembered losing friends, losing security, losing hope. She remembered the loneliness, the fear, the uncertainty. And she decided no one should face those struggles alone if she could help it. Within a year, she established scholarship programs for students from low-income families, students whose dreams were limited by finances, young people who simply needed an opportunity. Then she launched programs supporting single mothers, women rebuilding their lives after divorce, abandonment, or hardship. Next came community projects, educational initiatives, local charities, church outreach programs. The impact spread throughout the region. People who had never met Evelyn began benefiting from her generosity. Lives changed, families changed, entire communities changed. And with every project, her reputation grew, not as a wealthy woman, but as a good woman, a woman who remembered her pain, a woman who used her blessing to help others. Meanwhile, somewhere across town, another life was beginning to unravel. Richard Carter first heard about the land deal during a business lunch. At first he thought the rumors were exaggerated, then he saw the numbers. And everything inside him went cold. He read the article 3 times, then 4, then 5, certain he had misunderstood, but he hadn't. The woman he divorced, the woman he abandoned, the woman he claimed was holding him back, was now worth more than he had ever dreamed of becoming. Richard sat frozen. The article remained open on his phone, his lunch untouched, his mind racing. Questions flooded his thoughts. How and why didn't he know? But beneath those questions was something darker, regret, crushing regret. For the first time since the divorce, Richard began replaying every decision he had made, every lie, every betrayal, every moment he chose someone else over Evelyn. And for the first time, he wondered if he had made the biggest mistake of his life. At home, Lauren noticed the change almost immediately. Richard became distracted, quiet, irritable, obsessed with news about Evelyn. The relationship that once felt exciting suddenly felt strained. Arguments became frequent. Tension filled the house. The same excitement that had fueled their affair began disappearing. Reality had arrived. And reality wasn't nearly as glamorous as fantasy. One evening, Lauren confronted him. "Thinking about her, aren't you?" Richard looked away. The silence gave her the answer. The relationship never recovered. Because what Lauren feared most was true. She wasn't competing against Evelyn's money. She was competing against the realization of what Richard had lost. And deep down, Richard knew something he wasn't ready to admit. The greatest thing he had lost wasn't the fortune. It was the woman who received it. And as Evelyn's life continued rising higher than anyone imagined, Richard's world was beginning to collapse beneath him. Soon, the man who once walked away without looking back would find himself standing at her door, desperate, alone, and begging for something money could never buy: a second chance. The strange thing about consequences is that they rarely arrive all at once. They come in waves. One loss, then another, then another, until the person who once felt untouchable suddenly realizes the ground beneath them is disappearing. That was exactly what happened to Richard Carter. For years, he had walked through life believing he was in control. Control of his business, control of his marriage, control of his future, control of the people around him. But now, for the first time in decades, control was slipping away. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. The first blow came through his business. The same company he had spent years building began facing serious problems. Several major contracts were lost. A key partner withdrew from an important development project. Investors became nervous. Banks became cautious. Then the local media began connecting Richard's personal scandal to his public reputation. The story of the abandoned wife who became a philanthropist was still making headlines. And every time Evelyn appeared in another interview, people inevitably remembered Richard. The husband who left. The husband who cheated. The husband who walked away. Public sympathy belonged entirely to Evelyn. Richard found himself becoming the villain of a story everyone was following. At business events, conversations changed when he entered the room. Some people avoided eye contact. Others spoke to him differently. The respect he once enjoyed was fading. Slowly, painfully, public humiliation has a way of exposing things money cannot protect. And Richard was learning that lesson firsthand. Then came the second lesson. Lauren, the relationship that had once seemed exciting, was now strained beyond repair. The glamour was gone. The secrecy was gone. The thrill was gone. What remained was disappointment. Arguments became frequent. Small disagreements turned into major conflicts. The more Richard obsessed over Evelyn's success, the more Lauren noticed. And the more Lauren noticed, the angrier she became. One evening, their argument exploded. "You're still in love with her." Richard immediately denied it. But even he knew the denial sounded weak. Lauren laughed bitterly. "No." She shook her head. "You're in love with the life you threw away." The words hit harder than Richard wanted to admit. Because deep down, he feared she was right. Weeks later, Lauren packed her belongings and left. No dramatic farewell. No tears. No promises. Just silence. The same silence Richard had once forced upon Evelyn. Now he was the one sitting alone. Now he was the one staring at empty rooms. Now he was the one wondering how everything had fallen apart. For months, Richard tried convincing himself he could rebuild. Start over. Move forward. But every attempt felt hollow. The money wasn't enough. The success wasn't enough. The freedom he once wanted wasn't enough. Because the person he truly missed wasn't there. Evelyn, the woman who prayed for him, believed in him, supported him, forgave him repeatedly. The woman he had treated as though she would always be waiting. One Sunday morning, Richard drove past a church he hadn't attended in years. People were gathering for service, families walking together, children laughing, elderly couples holding hands. Something inside him broke. For the first time in years, he saw his life clearly, not through pride, not through excuses, not through self-justification, but through truth. He had destroyed his family, and nobody was responsible except him. That realization haunted him for weeks, until finally he made a decision. A decision he should have made years earlier. He would ask Evelyn for forgiveness, not because he deserved it, because he desperately needed it. The drive to her new home felt longer than it actually was. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. His heart pounded for a moment. He almost turned around, but he forced himself to continue. When he arrived, he sat in his car for several minutes, staring at the house, gathering courage. Then he walked to the front door and knocked. A few moments later, the door opened. For the first time in nearly 2 years, Richard stood face to face with Evelyn. Neither spoke immediately. Time seemed to stop. Richard noticed how different she looked, not younger, not wealthier, stronger, peaceful. There was a confidence about her he had never seen before, the confidence of someone who survived a storm. Evelyn simply looked at him, waiting. Finally, Richard spoke. "I need to talk to you," she hesitated, then stepped aside. A few minutes later, they sat across from each other, the same way they had sat across from each other thousands of times throughout their marriage, except now everything was different. Richard's eyes filled with tears, real tears, not manipulation, not performance, regret, pure regret. "I was wrong," his voice cracked. "I was wrong about everything." Evelyn remained silent, listening. Richard lowered his head. "I hurt you." Another pause. "I betrayed you." His voice trembled. "I destroyed our family." Several moments, neither moved. Then Richard said the words he had rehearsed 100 times. "Forgive me." Tears rolled down his face. "No, I don't deserve it." Another pause. "But if there's any chance," his voice broke completely. "Any chance at all?" He looked up. "I want to come home." Room fell silent. Only the ticking of a clock could be heard. For years, this was the moment Richard never imagined facing. The moment when the person he wounded held all the power. Meanwhile, news of the meeting quickly reached the family. And suddenly everyone had an opinion. Hannah believed reconciliation should at least be considered. People can change, she argued. People deserve second chances, especially when genuine repentance is involved. But Caleb felt differently, much differently. He remembered the years of pain, the missed graduations, the lies, the tears he watched his mother cry, the loneliness she endured. Why should she take him back, he asked. Where was he when she needed him? Other relatives joined the debate, friends offered advice, church members shared opinions, some emphasized forgiveness, others emphasized accountability. Everyone seemed to have an answer. Everyone except Evelyn, because she was the only one carrying the weight of the decision. The only one who knew what those years truly felt like. The only one who understood the depth of the wound. Night after night she prayed. Not for revenge. Not for vindication. For wisdom. The same God who carried her through betrayal would now have to guide her through forgiveness. Because forgiving Richard would be difficult. But deciding what came after forgiveness, that would be even harder. And soon, Evelyn would make a decision that would surprise everyone. A decision that revealed just how much God had transformed her heart during the darkest season of her life. The following Sunday, Evelyn arrived at church earlier than usual. The sanctuary was still quiet. Soft piano music drifted through the room as people slowly found their seats. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting colors across the wooden floor. Normally, Evelyn found peace the moment she entered the church. But today was different. Today her heart carried a burden. A decision. A decision everyone seemed to have an opinion about. Richard wanted another chance. Hannah believed reconciliation was possible. Caleb believed it would be a mistake. Friends offered advice. Family members shared their thoughts. Even strangers seemed convinced they knew what she should do. But deep down, Evelyn knew this decision could not be made by public opinion. It had to be made before God. As worship began, she closed her eyes. The lyrics spoke of grace, mercy, redemption, the very things she had spent years praying for. Yet as she stood there, another question kept returning. Could she truly forgive the man who had broken her heart? Not pretend to forgive, not say the words, actually forgive him. The service continued. Then the pastor stepped onto the platform. After greeting the congregation, he opened his Bible, and as soon as he announced the sermon title, Evelyn felt her heart skip. "Today," he said, "we're going to talk about forgiveness." Room fell silent. The pastor paused, then he began. One of the greatest misunderstandings in the Christian life is believing forgiveness and reconciliation are the same thing. Evelyn immediately looked up. The pastor continued. "Forgiveness is releasing a debt." He paused. "Reconciliation is rebuilding trust." Congregation listened carefully. "Forgiveness requires one willing heart." Another pause. "Reconciliation requires two transformed lives." Evelyn felt as though every word was speaking directly to her. For years she had assumed the two were inseparable, that forgiving Richard somehow meant returning to him, that extending grace meant pretending the past never happened. But now she was hearing something different, something she desperately needed. The pastor continued. "Some people refuse to forgive because they believe forgiveness lets the offender escape accountability." He shook his head. "That's not what forgiveness is." Sanctuary remained completely still. Forgiveness does not say what happened was acceptable. It does not erase consequences. It does not remove wisdom. It does not require you to place yourself back into a harmful situation. Then came the sentence that pierced Evelyn's heart. "Forgiveness means you trust God to handle justice so you can stop carrying bitterness." Tears immediately filled her eyes. Because for the first time she realized something. She wasn't angry anymore, not truly. The pain remained, the memories remained. But the bitterness had already begun leaving her heart months ago, through prayer, through healing, through surrender. She wasn't holding on to hatred. She was holding on to fear, fear of making the wrong decision, fear of being hurt again, fear of confusing forgiveness with reconciliation. As the sermon continued, Evelyn's thoughts drifted back through the past few years. She remembered the divorce papers, the empty apartment, the sleepless nights, the tears, the humiliation, the loneliness. Then she remembered the forgotten letter, the answered prayer, the opportunities, the people she had helped, the life God had built from the ruins. And suddenly she understood something. God had not merely restored her circumstances, He had restored her. The broken woman who knelt beside her bed months earlier was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, wiser, healthier. Someone who had learned that her value never depended on Richard's love or rejection. When the service ended, many people stood and talked, but Evelyn remained seated, praying silently, listening, waiting. And in that quiet moment, her decision became clear. A few days later, she called Richard. He arrived at her home shortly before sunset. The same nervousness filled him as before, the same uncertainty. But this time, Evelyn already knew what she needed to say. They sat together on the back patio overlooking the countryside. For a few moments, neither spoke. Then Evelyn finally broke the silence. "Forgive you." Richard's eyes immediately filled with tears. Years of guilt seemed to lift from his shoulders. For several seconds, he couldn't speak. Then he whispered, "Thank you." Evelyn wasn't finished. She took a deep breath, carefully choosing her words. "I forgive you completely." Another pause. "I hold no bitterness toward you." Richard nodded slowly. Hope began appearing in his eyes. Then came the part he wasn't expecting. "But I can't come back." Hope immediately faded. The words hung between them, heavy, final. Richard lowered his head. Evelyn continued gently. "Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened." Tears formed in her eyes as well. "I spent years praying for our marriage." She paused. "Years fighting for us." Richard looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "Trust we built was broken." Another pause. "And some things can't be rebuilt simply because we wish they could." Silence settled over them, the kind of silence that comes when truth finally arrives. Not cruel truth, not angry truth, just truth. For the first time, Richard fully understood the cost of his choices. Not financial cost, not public embarrassment, not loneliness, the cost of losing someone who genuinely loved him, and realizing that some opportunities only come once. Evelyn reached across the table and gently touched his hand, a final act of grace. "I truly hope you find healing," her voice softened, "and I pray God restores the parts of your life that are broken." Richard nodded slowly, tears rolling down his face. He knew she meant it. That was what made it so powerful. She wasn't rejecting him from anger. She wasn't punishing him. She wasn't seeking revenge. She had simply moved forward. And forward did not include returning to the life she had survived. Eventually Richard stood. They exchanged a final embrace, not as husband and wife, not as people beginning again, but as two people finally releasing the past. As he walked toward his car, Evelyn remained on the porch, watching the sunset, feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Complete peace, because forgiveness had set two people free that day, Richard from guilt, and Evelyn from the last remaining chains of her pain. But the most beautiful chapter of her story was still ahead, because the greatest blessing God gave Evelyn was never the money. It was the woman she became after surviving everything that was meant to destroy her. 5 years later, most people in Willow Creek still talked about Evelyn Carter, not because of her wealth, not because of the headlines, not because of the land, but because of what she chose to do after receiving everything she had once lost. Money changes many people, but somehow it never changed Evelyn. If anything, it revealed who she had always been. The same woman who once prayed for her struggling husband, the same woman who volunteered at church fundraisers, the same woman who believed God had a purpose even when life made no sense. The only difference was that now she had resources large enough to turn compassion into action. What began as a scholarship fund eventually became an educational foundation. Every year, hundreds of students received opportunities they never thought possible. Young men and women from struggling families attended college because someone they had never met believed in their future. Many of them had no idea their education traced back to a woman who once cried herself to sleep in a tiny apartment. Others knew her story well, and that story inspired them almost as much as the financial help itself. But education was only the beginning. Evelyn remembered the loneliness she experienced after her divorce. She remembered the fear of starting over, the uncertainty, the feeling that the world had moved on while she was still trying to survive. So she established programs for single mothers, women rebuilding after abandonment, women escaping unhealthy relationships, women trying to provide for their children while carrying burdens nobody else could see. The programs offered housing assistance, job training, counseling, childcare support, emergency resources, practical help for people facing practical problems. Thousands of lives were changed. Some families found stability, others found hope, many found both. Whenever someone thanked her publicly, Evelyn always gave the same response: "Know what it's like to need help." And she meant it. Years passed. The charitable work continued growing. New partnerships formed. Community centers opened. Local outreach expanded. Then came the hospitals, not entire hospital systems bearing her name. That wasn't the kind of recognition she wanted. Instead, she quietly funded cancer treatment programs, medical equipment purchases, patient assistance initiatives, children's health care services. People entered hospitals every day and received care they otherwise couldn't afford. Most never knew who made it possible. And Evelyn preferred it that way. She wasn't interested in applause. She was interested in impact. The churches benefited as well. Small congregations struggling to keep their doors open suddenly found support. Mission programs expanded. Food outreach programs grew. Community services multiplied. Not because Evelyn wanted influence, because she remembered the church that carried her when her life fell apart. The church where she knelt during one of the hardest seasons of her life. The church where she learned that forgiveness and reconciliation were not the same thing. The church where God began healing her heart. She never forgot. And because she never forgot, she continued giving. Meanwhile, Richard's life followed a much quieter path. He never fully recovered the business empire he once had. Some opportunities never returned. Some relationships remained broken. Some consequences stayed with him. Yet in an unexpected way, Richard also changed. The pride that once defined him slowly disappeared. The arrogance faded. The self-sufficiency softened. Years after the divorce, he returned to church, not for appearances, not for business connection, not for reputation, for himself, for healing, for forgiveness, for God. He and Evelyn occasionally spoke, mostly about family, the grandchildren, important events, life. The conversations were respectful, peaceful, healthy. There was no bitterness between them anymore, no hatred, no resentment, only acceptance. Both had learned difficult lessons. Both had survived painful seasons. Both had changed. But their paths no longer traveled in the same direction. And that was okay, because not every story ends with people getting back together. Sometimes the greater miracle is learning how to move forward without carrying the weight of yesterday. One autumn afternoon, several years later, Evelyn stood outside a newly completed scholarship center. Students filled the courtyard, families celebrated, photographs were being taken, laughter echoed across the campus. As she watched the scene unfold, Hannah walked beside her. "Mom?" Evelyn smiled. "Yes." Hannah looked around at the students, the buildings, the lives being changed. Then she asked a question she had wondered about for years. "If you could go back and change everything, would you?" For a moment, Evelyn didn't answer. Her eyes drifted across the crowd. She thought about the wedding, the betrayal, the divorce, the loneliness, the apartment, the forgotten letter, the blessings, the healing, the journey. Then she smiled softly. "No." Hannah looked surprised. "No." Evelyn shook her head. "If I changed the pain, I might lose everything the pain taught me." Tears filled Hannah's eyes because she understood exactly what her mother meant. Some victories aren't measured by what you gain. They're measured by who you become. As the sun began setting over Willow Creek, Evelyn looked toward the horizon, grateful, at peace, whole, not because life had been fair, not because every prayer had been answered the way she expected, but because God had remained faithful through every chapter, the good ones and the painful ones. And perhaps that was the greatest miracle of all. Richard spent years believing money was power. Evelyn discovered that faith, character, and forgiveness were worth far more. By the time Richard learned the lesson, Evelyn had already become everything he once said she never could. Some stories end with revenge, others end with reconciliation. But sometimes the greatest victory is neither. Sometimes the greatest victory is becoming someone your pain could not destroy. Richard spent years chasing success until he lost the people who mattered most. Evelyn lost everything she thought she needed, only to discover that faith, character, and forgiveness could build a life stronger than the one she had before. Life rarely unfolds the way we expect. Yet even the deepest betrayal does not have to become the final chapter. Sometimes it becomes the beginning of the story. By the time Richard learned the lesson, Evelyn had already become everything he once said she never could. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.